Joy DeSombre wasn't the type of woman who needed a man in her life. The 28-year-old single mom and college student had been down that road before.
I wasn't really interested in dating. When I'd finally gotten out of my first marriage, I was just sort of relieved and happy and very independent, and I had my 2 toddlers. I was moving forward in my life.
Men weren't on Joy's radar until a friend persuaded her to try her hand at online dating.
I met several different men. I just kept being disappointed. Nothing was really special to me about any of these men.
That is, until January 2002, when Joy began chatting with Joseph Kua, who said he was a 48-year-old commercial real estate broker with a degree from a prominent university.
Joseph was so far above and beyond all of the other guys, everything you could ever dream of. Romantic, spontaneous, fun, exciting, intellectual.
The only downside was that Joseph lived in Northern California, about 8 hours from Joy's San Diego home. But he was willing to travel for love. A month later, Joseph came to town and took Joy out on a proper date.
We went to dinner and we stayed there long after other people had already left. We were just having an amazing conversation.
Joseph just seemed to do everything right and say everything right. He asked her a lot of questions about herself, and they seemed immediately taken with each other.
Before long, the two began to date, and Joy noticed how great Joseph was with her children, quickly becoming the father figure they'd never had.
He would do anything they wanted. He was teaching them sports. He was just the all-American dad.
And Joseph seemed to have a disposable income, which he showered on Joy and her children. But exactly how Joseph made his money was a bit of a mystery.
I was never quite sure what Joseph did for a living. When you asked him about his job, he would simply say, "I'm in commercial real estate."
He said specifically, "I like to separate my business from my personal life. I make a lot of money, I'm very successful, but it is stressful what I do." And I thought, well, everything else about him is so wonderful. Why am I going to be so picky about this?
So Joy put her concerns aside, and by the fall of 2002, she and Joseph started talking marriage. They planned an intimate ceremony for the following June in Kauai, Hawaii.
He had grown up in Hawaii, and he told me all about it, so we were very excited about that.
Joseph's only wedding guests were going to be his longtime friend and business partner, 75-year-old Fernand Wagner, and his 64-year-old wife, Suzanne.
Joseph said that he had met Fernand, I think about a couple of decades before, and that Fernand had been a really successful restaurateur, and they had partnered up to be in commercial real estate together.
Joseph told Joy he was even the trustee on their will.
They didn't have any children. And Joseph was there for them. He helped them do a lot of things. He was their boy in a way.
But in February 2003, 4 months before the Wagners were to join Joy and Joseph on their wedding day, Joy received some surprising news.
I got pregnant. So by June, I was about 5 months along, and I couldn't fit into the wedding dress.
The wedding was postponed, but their lives together moved forward with the purchase of a beautiful 4-bedroom home in Southern California. Joy was excited until Joseph told her something odd.
He let me know that his name was going to be the only one on the title because he had a lot more money than I did. I argued with him about that, but he promised me that once we got married, that he'd add my name to the title to the house.
So Joy decided to let the argument go. She felt lucky to have a man like Joseph. But 3 years later, her luck would run out. On June 14, 2006, around 7 p.m., Joseph called Joy from Northern California. He was on his way home and had devastating news.
Hello? Joseph received a phone call from Fernand's nephew that Fernand had been murdered. And I asked about Suzanne, and he said, "Oh, she's dead too." I was so shocked. I said, oh my God, I can't believe this could have happened. And he acted like it was no big deal.
Joy assumed that Joseph was in shock, but when he arrived home later that evening, he seemed eerily calm.
Got on the computer, emailed some of the friends and family members of the Wagners. So sorry to hear that this has happened. And then he went to the gym.
The next morning, Joy slowly rolled over in bed and noticed something even more strange.
His hand was very badly swollen and purple, and you could see the blood right under the skin. Something seemed and felt desperately wrong.
In October 2003, 3 years before Joy DeSombre learned that her husband's business partners had been murdered, she and Joseph were celebrating the birth of a beautiful baby girl.
We agreed that we would name her Kauai, since that was the island where we were supposed to get married, so that was really special to us.
With a new baby, a destination wedding no longer seemed feasible. But 2 months later, Joseph had a surprise for Joy.
Joseph said, "Why don't we get married now? We'll go to Vegas." He said, "I'll just fly your parents out, and now we can make it official."
Joy was thrilled, and a week before Christmas, she and Joseph read their vows in a small chapel in Las Vegas.
He talked about how he had found his soulmate. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard.
Over the next year, the couple thrived as Joy took a job as an auto adjuster, and Joseph worked hard to provide for his new family.
He always seemed to have money for anything we wanted to do. We took nice vacations. We had a couple of boats. We definitely were living, I thought, the nice life.
But Joseph was still working 8 hours away in Northern California, and the distance between the newlyweds was beginning to wear on Joy.
Every time we planned a vacation, he would end up shortening it at the last minute because he'd have to race back up north for business. He never had a set schedule.
Joy began to worry that there might be other reasons why Joseph was away so much.
He would say I couldn't call him sometimes in the morning because he claimed he was out golfing with friends. I thought for sure that he was probably with someone else.
It didn't seem that he'd have any inclination to cheat because he seemed completely devoted to Joy and to the children.
Everybody reminded me, well, he does all these amazing things for you. I couldn't help but think, wow, maybe I am just being too nitpicky.
But in January 2005, just over a year into their marriage, Joy received a phone call that confirmed her deepest fear.
A woman from Northern California called me. She said that she had been seeing Joseph for the last 2 years.
She told Joy he had actually signed a domestic partnership with this woman, which in California is the same as a marriage.
According to the other woman, Joseph had described Joy as a crazy, strung-out addict with whom he'd had a one-night stand and a baby.
I responded that I was gainfully employed, that I didn't do drugs, that these things weren't true. I was just really blown away.
Joy immediately called Joseph and confronted him, but it was like talking to a stranger.
He said that it was my fault that he found her in the first place. He didn't have these small children running around like at our home. And it was more peaceful for him to go there. I couldn't believe that he let it go like that.
I felt so bad for her. My heart just ached. She was hysterical. She was sad. She was angry.
Joy wanted out of the marriage, but Joseph threatened that if she left, he would fight her for custody of Kauai and win. And there was something very unsettling about the tone of his voice.
I could almost feel it in my body, this horrible, hollowed out darkness. It was almost like the feeling of evil.
In the winter of 2005, after discovering Joseph's infidelity, Joy DeSombre wanted out of her marriage, but knew she was trapped.
He would remind me that if I left, I would have nothing. He would say, "You'll be a bad mother, I can prove it in court, I can get full custody of Kauai, you'll probably lose your other 2 children. He was always threatening.
So Joy came up with a plan to prepare herself for an inevitable divorce and did what she could to squirrel money away to her mother.
I could probably only send her $50, $100, maybe $150. Frankly, it probably would have taken a decade to get enough money together for a divorce attorney.
In the meantime, Joy resolved to keep the peace in the marriage.
I knew that I had to wait and just be patient to be able to build up enough money to have a decent divorce and provide a good life for my children.
Then that June, Joseph contacted Joy's father about visiting their home in Des Moines, Iowa with Kauai.
I think that my parents had planned on continuing a relationship with him even if we did get divorced, because, you know, he is Kauai's father and he did do a lot of things with her.
But at the last minute, Joseph canceled the trip.
He said the reason was business. There was a bounce check in the Bay Area. And how do you take care of a bounce check? That's something that's taken care of by your bank.
A few days later, on June 14, 2006, Joseph called Joy with some horrible news. He said Fernand and Suzanne Wagner had been shot to death in their home.
I just had tears rolling down my cheeks. I didn't know how to accept this. I was so in shock, I just didn't even know how to take it.
We didn't know what had happened. My first concern is that they were all in danger, possibly. It could be a situation where Joseph and Ferdinand had made somebody angry. They got Ferdinand and they're going to be after Joseph next, or his family.
Joy fully expected Joseph to remain up north to handle things for his dear friends. Instead, he told her he was planning to swing by one of his boats and would be back in San Diego later in the evening.
And he said, I'll get up there later on after the will is read. They're not going to do anything yet. And so it was about the will. It wasn't about them.
Meanwhile, investigators in Millbrae, California were busy trying to solve the Wagners' murders.
I've never seen anything as violent and as horrendous as this. I see two lifeless people laying there, people who were, coming into their golden years of their life. It shook me to the core.
At first, it appeared that the Wagners were victims of a robbery and sexual assault.
There are drawers open all around us. In the area where the bodies were located was Mrs. Wagner's underwear balled up on the couch nearby.
But something didn't add up. As investigators dug a little deeper, they uncovered evidence that suggested the killer might be someone the Wagners knew.
There didn't appear to be any kind of forced entry. So immediately we're thinking maybe the person that had done this knew the family.
Meanwhile, when Joseph arrived home later that night, it was business as usual.
He showed up at the house a couple hours later with fast food in his hand, sat down, ate his fast food, got on the computer, and then he went to the gym. He came home after the gym and went to bed and slept like a baby.
On June 15th, the following morning, Joy rolled over in bed and noticed something odd. Joseph was covered with bruises and cuts. But when Joy questioned Joseph, he had an explanation for everything.
He told me that the bruise on his shin he got while he was rollerblading, and that the horrible bruising on his hand was from a refrigerator falling on it. And I couldn't help but think, there's something wrong with these stories.
The following day, Joy headed out to meet Joseph on one of their boats with the kids, when her mom called with some shocking news.
I said they just released the cause of death. The Wagners were not shot in the head.
She held the phone out and played a live stream on their computer from a newscast, and it said that they'd been beaten to death. And that's when I knew. And I said, I know he did it. He's covered in bruises. He's the murderer.
The world stopped for just a minute. You can't catch your breath. What on earth are we going to do now? She's on her way to meet a man that she knows murdered somebody.
I was terrified. I was crying. I was pounding on the desk. I was so frightened that something would happen to her.
Joy knew she couldn't risk letting on that she suspected Joseph was a killer.
I knew the best thing to do was to go right into the eye of the storm and put on the best acting job of my life I was going to sleep on a boat with my 3 children next to a brutal murderer.
Years into her marriage, Joy DeSombre was suddenly terrified that her husband would discover that she knew he was a killer. So she met him on the boat as planned.
And we drove on to the marina. We acted like everything was normal.
Meanwhile, Joy's mother called the tip line, but all she got was resistance.
The individual who answered the phone simply said, "This is out of my jurisdiction."
For the next 24 hours, Joy stayed with Joseph and kept up her act, hoping he wouldn't turn his rage on her and the kids.
And I continued to be the supportive wife for him, and I was terrified.
We didn't know if they'd be safe. We didn't know what would happen during the night.
Later that day, on June 17th, Joseph told Joy he was heading back upstate. Joy headed straight to the police.
I called the detectives, and they had been looking for him all week. That's when I found out that they knew very early on that he was a person of interest.
Police put out an APB on Joseph's truck, and it wasn't long before he was spotted at another marina in Southern California. Police immediately took him into custody.
I felt so much relief that he'd been caught, and our daughter and our grandchildren weren't going to be in danger.
Police charged Joseph with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for multiple murder. And the more investigators dug up about Joseph's life, the less Joy realized she knew about her own husband.
I found out that he was not business partners with Fernand, that he was merely a maintenance man for them. And they were paying him $525 a month for a few hours of work to collect rent checks and do some minor maintenance. He had been skimming from rent checks and keeping the money for himself, moving money from accounts, kiting checks. I was so shocked. I was devastated.
Investigators believe that by the spring of 2006, Joseph had embezzled more than $200,000 from the Wagners, and Fernand finally figured it out.
Fernand Wagner confronted Joseph Kua in his house. I think he told Joseph that knew he was stealing money from him, and he wasn't going to put up with it anymore. And something snapped in Joseph Kua's mind.
And Joseph was particularly enraged. Fernand's throat was cut. Suzanne had been strangled. Both the Wagners were brutally beaten.
He couldn't have boats and houses and cars and travel without the Wagner's money. His life, as he knew it, was over. And I think he just lost it.
Joseph himself had racked up tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt and made faulty claims on his income taxes, leaving Joy to pick up the pieces.
The vehicles were repossessed. The house was foreclosed upon. This was emotionally and financially devastating.
On June 2nd, 2008, Joseph went to trial and pleaded not guilty.
Joseph has never admitted guilt. He claims that he's innocent and that a third party murdered the Wagners.
On June 27th, 2008, Joseph Kua was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder.
I was so excited and so relieved. My children and I could be free of this person, and we didn't have to be afraid anymore.
On December 18th, 2008, Joy and Joseph's 5-year wedding anniversary, Joseph was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Their divorce was finalized in March 2009.
I think Joy is probably stronger than she was. She's paid a heavy price for this strength, but I think she's going to be okay.
Today, Joy and her children live with her parents and are slowly picking up the pieces.
My kids are just amazingly strong, and they're always there for me. And I hope that I've been a good example to them in how to turn this around in a positive way.
Joy is happy. She's hopeful. She's well-adjusted. She has taken a whole new direction in her life.
I'm moving on and using this as a lesson so that I can help educate others and so that I can do something really positive with what has happened in our lives. I'm not interested in dating again or getting married or anything like that or becoming serious with anybody. I think my children are significant enough, and that's, I think, how I'll live the rest of my life.
Paul Rydell's first love was purely physical.
Football was my first passion. I think I was always blessed athletically and put so much into it because that's where I got to bring my feelings out.
But Paul's brawny exterior was hiding an unhappy past.
I never knew my dad, and my dad left when I was young. And my mother, I felt like she resented me or didn't like me. It defined me in a sense. I was constantly looking for approval from her.
In the fall of 1998, Paul was 29 years old and living alone in Amityville, New York. He was determined to put his troubles behind him, with a little help from his best friend and workout partner, Alex Algieri.
He was kind of the opposite of me. He was very mellow, very laid back, and we just really blended well together.
Alex and Paul were not only the closest of friends, but they actually had a similar physical appearance. They both had dark hair. They both drove the same car.
We were with each other every minute of every day for years.
The two friends were also successful entrepreneurs, having just opened one of the country's first 24-hour fitness centers.
At that time, the concept really wasn't there, so we were very successful, and that's when the fitness craze was really starting to take off.
That winter, Paul was riding high on his success. And while he wasn't looking for love, he certainly had his fair share of admirers. One in particular was 26-year-old Leanne Armanini, a single mother who worked at a local bar.
She had a son, maybe about 11, 12, and I think that's one of the things that kind of gravitated me towards her, the nurturing part.
After a few casual dinners, Paul and Leanne began to date. A year later, when Leanne realized she was pregnant, Paul decided it was a good time to take the relationship to the next level. When the couple tied the knot that July, it was a true shotgun wedding.
It was a really nice wedding. I had two best men, and Alex was one of them.
7 months later, the couple's son Nicholas was born.
Nicholas's birth changed Paul's entire view of life. For the first time, I think, Paul truly experienced what real love is like.
I started learning how great it feels to give more than it is to get. He's just the most amazing human being.
But before Nicholas turned 1 year old, tragedy struck, and Paul's entire life changed forever. It all started the evening of January 17th, 2001, while Paul was taking a few hard-earned hours away from the gym.
A friend of mine wanted to go out to dinner, so I asked Al to cover for me. Started having drinks, started saying no. I never ended up going back to work.
At about 10 that evening, Paul's cell phone began to ring.
So I picked it up. It was Leanne, frantic, telling me about Alex got shot.
The news hit like a ton of bricks. Alex Algieri, Paul's friend and business partner, had been gunned down in the parking lot of their gym.
I couldn't believe it. And Al didn't argue or fight with anybody. You know, he was a very easygoing guy. It didn't make no sense it would be Al.
Paul was devastated and confused, but his wife Leanne was terrified.
This execution-style murder has all the markings of a mafia hit. A small caliber weapon at night, shots to the head.
While Alex had no enemies to speak of, Paul's reputation as a tough guy was well known. Leanne was certain the bullets were not meant for Alex, but for her husband.
Leanne comes to Paul and says, not only are you in danger, but I'm in danger as your wife, and more importantly, the baby's in danger.
Was this tragedy a case of mistaken identity?
The very first thing that Paul did was come here and have me draft a will, leaving everything that he owned to Leanne.
In the spring of 2000, 9 months before his best friend and business partner was murdered, Paul Rydell was struggling to adjust to his young marriage with Leanne.
First couple months are okay. You know, I started going back out with my friends, like a live party with my friends, coming home real late. I was still very young.
On the outside, Paul had much to celebrate. His 24-hour gym was booming, and he and his partner, Alex Algieri, had achieved enormous success.
My life, I mean, as far as I was concerned, was great. I was going out with my friends, business was good, had money.
But behind closed doors, life with Leanne had become somewhat rocky.
It got to the point where she was really tired of me going out and not coming home and doing the things I needed to do.
So one day that June, while Paul was away from home, Leanne took matters into her own hands.
A friend of mine goes to my house to visit me, and he calls me up. He goes, Paul, there's 2 moving trucks in your house. They're emptying out and they're moving out your house.
Stunned, Paul immediately raced home. But it was too late. Leanne had made up her mind to move to Florida and start a new life with her mother. Nothing Paul said would stop her.
I just think she probably got fed up and said, you know, I'm leaving. I'm going to Florida. And at that point, I was okay with us not being married or getting a divorce.
But the game changer for Paul was Leanne's determination to take their infant son, Nicholas, with her.
At that very moment, life changed for me. I realized, like, wow, this is real. Like, you know, I'm gonna lose my son. I went to see a lawyer. I didn't know what else to do.
Paul's case ultimately found its way to my desk. And during my initial meeting with him, he was overwrought with fear, not about the fact that his wife had left him, but about the fact that the baby was gone.
Steve immediately got to work, and it wasn't long before he realized Leanne was breaking the law.
The general rule is that one spouse who has custody of a child can simply not unilaterally pack up and move to a distant domicile without either the permission of the other spouse or leave of court. The court directed her to return with the child within 20 days or face the loss of custody.
It was a quick victory for Paul. That July, Leanne headed back to New York, Nicholas in tow.
I just wanted to have a relationship with my son, and you can't have a relationship when you're a child 2,000 miles away.
A divorce proceeding had been scheduled for November 21st. But on that day, things took a surprising turn.
I arrived in court a little bit early. I was setting up at the table, and I heard the door open up, and I turned around, and I saw Paul come walking in, holding the baby, and Leanne behind him pushing a stroller.
Steve was stunned.
I looked at Paul and he said, listen, I want you to withdraw this. We work things out. And I said to him, listen, wait a minute. We can adjourn this, we can postpone this, but withdrawing this is a significant thing.
But Paul stood firm. He and Leanne wanted the divorce withdrawn.
I knew that I could do better. And I was, you know, seeing what I lost, I was ready to try and do that. Absolutely, I was ready to really try and do that.
Despite his misgivings, Steve withdrew the proceeding, while Paul and Leanne set about making amends.
At that point, I just wanted to work. I wanted to be with my son.
Meanwhile, back at the office, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. In particular, he was bothered by an affidavit Leanne had filed upon her return to New York.
Before we conducted the hearing, Leanne filed opposition papers designed to convince the judge that she should not be forced to come back to New York. One of the reasons that she detailed for leaving was her contention that she was advised that there was a mafia contract out on Paul's life. Now, Paul was not, and he has never been, involved with any organized crime faction.
While Leanne's suspicions seemed questionable, Steve would soon learn she was onto something.
The first thing that I thought was, oh my God, she's right.
But he could never have guessed how it would all play out. Disaster was just on the horizon.
Everything happened so fast and the wrong man was killed.
In January 2001, Paul Rydell was doing his best to be a good husband to Leanne.
I was putting more of an effort into making things better. I was just trying to be a better husband. And I felt like it was working and we were getting along better.
But Leanne didn't seem entirely comfortable.
There would be times when Leanne would say, Paul, I'm gonna run to the store, just keep an eye on the baby. And one of Paul's friends would drop by and say, listen, your wife is on the payphone at the corner, what's going on?
I confronted her about it. And she says, it's my mother. I really gotta ease into this slowly with my mother. She's giving me a hard time.
The explanation made sense. Paul knew Leanne's mother wasn't very fond of him, but he had very little time to dwell on that problem. Just 2 weeks later, he was blindsided by one of the worst tragedies of his life. The evening of January 17th, 2001, Paul was at dinner with a friend when Leanne called him with terrible news. Alex Algieri had been shot execution-style in the parking lot of their gym.
Alex Algieri went outside to his SUV to get some CDs. Unbeknownst to him, there were two men waiting in a car. Shots rang out in very quick succession, and Alex stumbled back into the gym, muttered, "I've been shot," to a witness, and died a few minutes later.
The killers fled the scene, leaving no evidence behind. Paul was devastated.
It didn't make no sense. What type of man sneaks behind somebody like that with a gun?
The following days were tough, but there was one person who stood by Paul's side, his wife, Leanne.
She was the one person that I felt that I could talk to, and she was the person I was leaning on. She went to the funeral with me. She never cried. I was always wondering why she didn't cry.
Meanwhile, as the investigation into Alex's murder picked up steam, a frightening theory began to take shape.
Paul came to the conclusion, as did I, and as did the police themselves, that this homicide was a mistake, that the intended victim was clearly Paul.
For Leanne, the thought was terrifying.
Leanne comes back to Paul and says, there really was a mafia contract on your life, and it's still out there.
She begged Paul to let her go back to Florida and take Nicholas with her.
So I told her, listen, let's figure this out. Get your stuff together, go to Florida. Take the baby, go to Florida.
Meanwhile, Paul stayed behind and began to prepare for the worst.
I went into Steve's office and I made a will of leaving everything to Leanne, thinking that she would make sure that that money was there for Nicholas when he got older.
Over the next 2 months, Paul shuttled back and forth between New York and Florida, juggling family and business. Before long, Leanne told Paul she was pregnant again.
He was overjoyed. The concept of being the father that he never had is what dominated his entire being.
But Paul's happiness would soon fade. Several weeks later, during one of his trips to Florida, a family friend gave Paul some unsettling news.
He goes, I gotta talk to you. He goes, every time you leave, she goes out with this guy, Rocco. I went home and I confronted her. I'm like, who's this guy, Rocco? And she literally dropped.
Leanne claimed Rocco was just a friend, but Paul wasn't buying it.
I said, you know what? I said, I'm leaving. I left, went home.
Shortly after Paul returned to New York, Leanne made an unexpected move. She served Paul with divorce papers.
To commence a divorce action in Florida, all you have to show is that you've lived in Florida for 6 consecutive months. Well, 2 weeks after she met the 6-month residency requirement, Leanne filed an action for divorce against Paul in Florida. And now, Nicholas has lived in Florida for 6 months with our consent, and now we can't get him back.
On December 24th, 2001, when Leanne gave birth to another baby boy, she refused to let Paul see him.
I was calling around hospitals and trying to find out where the baby was, and nobody would tell me anything.
It seemed Paul was on the verge of losing everything once again. To make matters worse, Alex's murder remained unsolved.
I was emotionally spent. I went to kind of a depression, and that was bad. That was really bad.
But things were about to take a surprising turn.
and I get a call from Paul, who's absolutely frantic. And he says, I caught the murderer, she's involved.
And when the whole twisted story came out, it shocked everyone.
I'm like, how did I not put this together?
It was like being hit in the face with a 100-pound dumbbell.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By spring 2002, Paul Rydell knew his marriage to Leanne was over. But his son Nicholas weighed heavily on his mind.
I wasn't upset about me and her. At this time, I was just upset about Nicholas. I didn't know how I was going to see Nicholas.
In addition, the murder of Paul's best friend, Alex Algieri, was no closer to being solved.
I think that the most overcoming emotion has always been dealing with that Alex died.
But everything was about to change. In November 2001, more than a year after Alex was shot, police got a surprising and unexpected break when they arrested a suspect for grand larceny.
Part of the NYPD's normal regimen with every arrest is they debrief the suspect as to their knowledge of other crimes.
The suspect claimed to have knowledge of Alex's murder. The information he gave detectives led them to a Florida bodybuilder named Ralph Salerno, also known as Rocco. It was the very same Rocco Leanne had claimed was just a friend. Police immediately took Rocco in for questioning. And it wasn't long before he spilled the whole twisted truth.
Salerno made a very incriminating statement to the police. He basically made a statement where he confessed to the crime and implicated Leanne in the conspiracy and described driving from Florida to New York with an accomplice with the sole purpose of shooting Paul Rydell to death.
Investigators discovered that Rocco and Leanne had been having an affair in Florida. But that was just the beginning. It seemed Leanne wanted to use Rocco for much more than just dating.
I think very early on, once she was directed by the judge to come back to New York so that Paul could exercise his visitation rights with Nicholas, she realized the only way I'm going to be able to leave New York is either with Paul's consent, which there's no way he's going to give to me, or if Paul is killed.
And with Rocco's help, that's allegedly what Leanne set out to do. She gave Rocco a photo of Paul, but that fateful night, Rocco and his crony mistook Alex for Paul and shot him dead.
Leanne reportedly called Salerno a bleeping idiot and told him he killed the wrong guy.
To top it all off, Leanne's newborn son, the baby Paul thought was his, was actually Rocco's.
I found out by the news being on my front lawn. They were like, what do you think about your ex-wife being pregnant by the guy who just got arrested for killing your best friend? I was like, what? That's how I found out. I had no idea. I thought it was my kid.
It was like being hit in the face with a 100-pound dumbbell. I mean, it was like, oh my God, could she really be this devious?
In March 2003, Leanne Rydell was arrested at her home in Florida.
It was bittersweet. My first feeling has always been the effect that it had on Nicholas.
On April 24, 2004, Leanne was found guilty of first-degree murder for orchestrating the killing. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. Today, Paul is the father he always set out to be. He has full custody of Nicholas. He also has a new daughter and a wife he loves. He tries not to dwell on the past.
You can go forward or you can go backwards, and backwards is nowhere where I want to be. Backwards is a dark place. I want to move forward. I want to move forward I want to think about all the wonderful things that I got with my wife, all the wonderful things I got with my children. I don't go backwards.
But one part of Paul's past he'll never forget, his best friend Alex.
I miss him dearly. He'll always be my best friend. But God, how our friendship would have been greater now, because I would have gave him back as much as he gave me.
The call came just before dawn, a shaky voice cutting through the static, whispering a name that hadn't been spoken out loud in years, a name buried under dust, headlines, and a Florida summer that never really ended. And in that moment, the past didn't knock politely. It kicked the door in, because for 3 decades the case had been frozen in time, a cold case stamped and shelved, until that voice said it knew what happened, until it said there was a confession, until it said the truth was coming from a man who was dying and had nothing left to lose. Florida, 1992. Heat clung to everything like a second skin, the kind of heat that made tempers shorter and nights longer, the kind that warped memory. A quiet coastal county, palm trees lining roads that led nowhere fast, a place where people noticed when something fell off. And something did. A woman vanished on an ordinary weekday morning. No struggle reported, no screams, no shattered glass, just absence, sudden and complete, the kind that makes neighbors second-guess what they saw through their curtains and what they didn't. Her car was found later that day, parked neatly as if she intended to come back. Keys missing, door unlocked, the interior untouched, no blood, no obvious sign of a crime, just silence where a life should have been. She was known, not famous, not notorious, but known in the way small communities know their own. A regular routine, familiar face, someone whose disappearance sent a ripple through grocery store aisles and church pews. Flyers went up within hours. Phone lines buzzed. Deputies knocked on doors under a sun that refused to set early. Search parties combed marshland, ditches, stretches of highway, where nothing ever happened until it did. Helicopters circled low, their blades chopping the humid air, eyes scanning for movement that never came. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly, painfully, the searches turned quieter, the questions harder, the hope thinner. Investigators started where they always do. Family, friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seen her last, spoken to her last, argued with her last. Timelines were drawn and redrawn, receipts examined, phone records pulled, the paper kind, long before digital trails told stories for you. Witnesses remembered fragments, a car they couldn't quite describe, a sound they weren't sure mattered, a stranger's face that blurred under pressure. Each lead promised something and delivered nothing. The case file grew thick with possibilities and thin on answers. Rumors filled the vacuum left by facts. An argument overheard days earlier. A shadowy figure seen near the parking lot. A tip about a man who left town suddenly. Another about someone who'd always given people a bad feeling. Names circled, then crossed out. Suspects were questioned, cleared, questioned again. Alibis held just well enough to frustrate detectives who felt the truth hovering just out of reach. Evidence was sent to labs that took months, then years. Results came back inconclusive. Technology wasn't there yet. DNA was a promise more than a solution. By the end of the first year, the headlines changed. Missing became cold case. The words carried weight. They meant the active searches were over, that resources were shifting, that the case would live on in filing cabinets and the memories of those who refused to forget. The community didn't move on so much as it learned to live with a gap, an empty seat, a question mark at the end of every conversation about that summer. Birthdays passed without celebration. Anniversaries came and went, each one reopening a wound that never properly healed. Detectives rotated. A new face would take over, read the reports, make the same phone calls, chase the same dead ends. Every few years, a tip would reignite the fire. Someone claimed to know something. Someone said they'd heard a confession at a bar, in a car, late at night when secrets slipped out with the alcohol. Each time, hope spiked, then crashed. The truth stayed buried, or so it seemed. Then, decades later, When most people assumed the file would never leave the shelf again, the phone rang. A nurse, careful with her words. A patient, terminal. Cancer. Days, maybe weeks to live. He'd been restless, agitated, asking to speak to law enforcement. He said it was about a woman who disappeared in the early 90s. He said he couldn't die with it anymore. Investigators approached cautiously. Deathbed confessions were tricky. Some were real. Some were fantasies. Attempts to rewrite a life at the last moment, to feel powerful, important, forgiven. Still, they went. They sat beside a hospital bed surrounded by the quiet hum of machines, the smell of antiseptic, the ticking clock that measured what little time remained. The man was older now, gaunt, barely recognizable compared to the photos from the file. But his eyes were sharp, focused. He used the victim's name without prompting. He knew details that hadn't been public, or at least details he shouldn't have known. He talked slowly, between breaths, painting a picture that made the room feel smaller. He described the day, the heat, the chance encounter. He spoke of panic, of a decision made too fast to take back. He claimed he'd acted alone. He claimed he knew where it happened, how it ended, why no one ever found her. Detectives listened, recording every word, hearts racing as the story seemed to fill gaps that had been empty for years. This was it, they thought, the break that would finally bring closure. But even as the confession unfolded, cracks appeared. Timelines didn't line up perfectly. Certain details conflicted with physical evidence, or what little physical evidence there was. When pressed, the man grew vague, then defensive. He blamed failing memory, medication, the fog of pain. He insisted the core of it was true. He begged them to believe him. When he died days later, the headlines exploded. Cold case solved, they said. Deathbed confession stuns investigators. Cameras returned to streets they hadn't filmed in decades. Old photos were dug up, broadcast again, faces frozen in time. The community felt something stir, a mix of relief and dread. At last, an answer. At last, a name to attach to the nightmare. But closure is a fragile thing. As detectives reviewed the confession against the case file, doubts grew louder. Searches based on the man's claims turned up nothing. No remains, no belongings, no definitive proof. His story explained some things, but not all. And in a case built on what wasn't there, absence mattered. Families asked questions. Reporters pressed for certainty. Investigators spoke carefully, choosing words that acknowledged progress without promising finality. Officially, the case leaned toward resolution. Unofficially, it remained unsettled, a puzzle with pieces that almost fit, but not quite. Because in Florida, 1992, a woman still vanished without a trace. And decades later, even with a confession echoing from a hospital room, the truth still feels just out of reach, hovering between what was said and what can be proven, between a headline that claims an ending and a reality that refuses to settle, leaving behind a familiar, haunting silence where answers should be. The silence after the funeral was heavier than before, because now it carried a name, a face, a story that was supposed to explain everything, and yet nothing felt settled. Not for the detectives who reopened old boxes of evidence. Not for the family who waited decades for certainty. Not for a community that learned the hard way that a confession does not equal truth. Files were pulled from storage rooms that smelled like dust and paper. Manila folders stacked on metal tables. Photographs curled at the edges. Notes written in pen by hands long retired or buried. Every page was reread with new eyes. Every margin scribble suddenly suspicious. Every overlooked detail demanding attention. The man's words were transcribed line by line, played back through cheap speakers in a cramped office, his voice thin but deliberate, describing places investigators knew well, roads they had driven 100 times, landmarks that anchored memory. Some details matched, others drifted. He placed himself at the right general area on the right day, but his timeline wobbled when compared to verified sightings. He claimed a confrontation that no witness ever reported, described movements that would have required time he didn't seem to have. When pressed by the tape, his pauses felt longer, his certainty weaker, like someone reaching for a memory that might not exist. Detectives split into camps without saying it out loud. Some believed. They pointed to the non-public details, the way he spoke the victim's name, the emotion that crept into his voice at unexpected moments. Others were cautious, burned by years of false hope. They noted inconsistencies, the lack of physical corroboration, the convenient timing of a confession delivered when consequences no longer mattered. They asked the question no one wanted to hear. What if he was lying, or worse? What if he believed a story he told himself for so long it felt real? Search teams returned to places mentioned in the confession. Swamps that swallowed sound, patches of scrubland, now altered by development, houses standing where emptiness once stretched. Ground-penetrating radar swept the earth in slow, methodical lines. Dogs sniffed for traces long faded. Each pass raised anticipation, then crushed it. Nothing. No bones. No fabric. No object that could anchor the story in reality. The land kept its secrets, indifferent to human urgency. The media fed on the uncertainty. One day, headlines declared the mystery over. The next, they questioned everything. Experts were invited to speculate, to dissect the psychology of dying confessions, to explain how memory degrades, how guilt and fantasy can merge. Former detectives weighed in, some calling it a breakthrough, others warning against premature closure. The case lived again in public, louder than it had been in years, but noise didn't equal clarity. The family felt pulled apart by it. They wanted to believe. They needed to believe. After years of limbo, the idea that someone had finally spoken felt like oxygen. Yet doubt crept in with every unanswered question. If he was responsible, where was she? Why hide the truth for so long, only to reveal it in fragments? Why leave them still searching? Closure dangled just out of reach, cruel in its proximity. Investigators dug deeper into the man's past. In 1992, he was a familiar presence in the area, not a stranger drifting through, but someone who belonged just enough to blend in. He had brushes with the law, nothing major, nothing that would have put him on the original suspect list. He worked odd jobs, knew the back roads, understood how easy it was to disappear in plain sight. He had been questioned briefly back then, cleared quickly, his name relegated to a footnote in a thick file. Now, that footnote screamed for attention. They tracked down old associates, people who hadn't spoken to police in decades. Some were surprised by the news. Others weren't. One remembered a strange comment years ago, something said late at night, brushed off at the time as dark humor. Another recalled him leaving town abruptly not long after the disappearance, returning months later thinner, quieter. None of it was enough. Hearsay stacked on hearsay. A tower that swayed but wouldn't fall into place. The physical evidence, such as it was, offered little comfort. Items recovered near the abandoned car had never yielded results. Fibers that couldn't be sourced. Prints that didn't match anyone in the system. DNA samples preserved in conditions far from ideal. Degraded beyond usefulness. Advances in technology promise miracles. But miracles require material, and this case was built on absence. As months passed, pressure mounted to make a declaration. The public wanted an ending. Politicians wanted statistics that showed progress. Families wanted peace. Internally, the debate continued. Could they close the case based on a confession alone, especially one that couldn't be verified? What message would that send? That saying the right words at the right moment was enough to rewrite history? In quiet moments, detectives revisited the beginning, asking uncomfortable questions about what might have been missed. A witness discounted too quickly, a tip buried under paperwork, a suspect who never quite fit, but was never pursued hard enough. The confession forced them to look backward as much as forward, to confront the possibility that the truth had slipped past them long ago. The community watched, divided. Some accepted the story, ready to move on, to finally put a period at the end of a sentence that had dragged on for 30 years. Others felt uneasy, sensing that something didn't add up, that the neatness of a deathbed confession clashed with the messiness of real crime. Conversations in diners and living rooms circled the same questions, whispered like they might summon answers. Official statements remained carefully worded. The case was described as significantly advanced, close to resolution, language designed to satisfy, without committing. Internally, the files stayed open, a liminal state that mirrored the emotional reality of everyone involved. And beneath it all, the same image persisted. A car parked too neatly, a door left unlocked, a life interrupted without explanation. A confession had changed the shape of the mystery, but not its weight. The cold case had warmed, stirred, drawn breath again, yet it refused to die, lingering in the space between belief and proof, reminding everyone that sometimes the most haunting part of a story isn't what's revealed at the end, but what remains stubbornly hidden. Time began to stretch in strange ways once the confession lost its shine, days folding into weeks as investigators chased what remained. Not the rush of a breakthrough, but the slow, grinding work of verification. Because in cases like this, truth doesn't announce itself, it resists. And the deeper they dug into the man's story, the more it seemed to shift beneath their feet. They mapped his movements in 1992 again, not from memory but from records, pay stubs, time cards, gas receipts, the dull paperwork that outlives human recollection. Each document placed him somewhere specific, and every placement raised a new question. He had been close, yes, but proximity was not guilt, and the gap between being nearby and being responsible was wider than headlines suggested. They returned to the witnesses whose statements had faded into the background of the case file. People now older, slower, surprised to be asked again about a day they had tried to forget. Memories resurfaced unevenly. One woman remembered seeing the victim that morning, calm, unhurried, no sign of distress. A man recalled a vehicle idling near the lot, engine running, driver obscured by glare and distance. Another witness insisted there had been an argument, though no one else remembered it. Each recollection carried the weight of time, altered by years of retelling, by news coverage, by the human need to make sense of chaos. The confession had reshaped their memories too, without meaning to. Witnesses began aligning what they recalled with what they had heard. Investigators had to separate original observation from later influence, a delicate process that felt like untangling threads already knotted by decades. The past, once disturbed, refused to settle back into place. Attention shifted to the abandoned car again, the silent centerpiece of the case. Photographs were enlarged, details scrutinized that had once seemed irrelevant. The angle of the wheels, the position of the seat, the absence of personal items that should have been there. It looked staged, some said, as if someone wanted it to be found exactly that way. The confession suggested panic, haste, but the scene suggested deliberation. Two stories competing in still images frozen in time. Investigators re-examined alternate theories that had been pushed aside. An opportunistic predator passing through. A personal connection, never fully explored. A scenario involving more than one person. Something the confession firmly denied. Each theory came with its own problems, its own unanswered questions, but together they painted a picture far less tidy than the one offered from a hospital bed. The man's personal history grew darker under scrutiny, not because of documented violence, but because of patterns, sudden moves, jobs abandoned without explanation, relationships that ended abruptly, people who described him as intense, secretive, capable of charm that turned cold without warning. None of it proved anything. All of it suggested possibility, the kind of possibility that keeps detectives awake at night, replaying conversations, weighing words spoken long ago. As doubts grew, so did frustration. The confession had promised an ending, but instead it reopened wounds, raised expectations it couldn't satisfy. Families who had stayed quiet for years now faced cameras again, asked how it felt to be so close and yet so far. Their answers were careful, restrained, but the exhaustion was visible. Closure had become a moving target. Internally, law enforcement faced a reckoning. Admitting uncertainty after declaring progress was not easy. Public trust hung in the balance. So did the integrity of the investigation. They could declare the case solved and move on, accepting the gaps as unfortunate but unavoidable. Or they could keep pushing, risking criticism for chasing ghosts, for refusing to let go. The debate wasn't just professional. It was personal. Many of the detectives involved had spent a significant part of their careers circling this case. Letting it end on a maybe felt like betrayal. New forensic reviews were ordered. A last attempt to pull something concrete from what remained. Evidence was sent to modern labs, specialists tasked with extracting meaning from samples collected in a different era. Results trickled in slowly. Most were inconclusive. One test raised eyebrows, then fell apart under closer examination. Hope flared and died repeatedly, a cycle that took its toll. The confession itself became a subject of study. Behavioral analysts listened to the tapes, dissected tone and word choice, the rhythm of his speech. They noted moments of confidence, moments of uncertainty. They debated whether the emotions sounded genuine or performative. The conclusion, frustratingly, was split. Some believed he was reliving a real event. Others believed he was constructing a narrative, piecing together public knowledge with imagination and guilt that may not have belonged to him alone. Meanwhile, the community continued to live in the shadow of the case. For younger residents, it was a story they had grown up hearing, a local legend with real consequences. For older ones, it was unfinished business, a reminder of a time when safety felt different, when trust was easier. The confession had briefly united them in hope, but the lingering doubt left a deeper scar. The man who had confessed was now buried, his secrets either spent or sealed forever. With his death, the possibility of clarification vanished. No follow-up questions, no chance to confront contradictions. Whatever truth he carried went with him, leaving investigators to argue with a recording and a memory. As the months dragged on, the case settled into a new, uneasy phase. Not cold anymore, but not warm enough to resolve. A limbo defined by questions that refused to be answered. The confession had changed the narrative, but it had not closed the book. Instead, it had added another chapter filled with uncertainty, forcing everyone involved to confront a painful reality. Sometimes, even when someone finally speaks, the truth remains just out of reach, buried not only in the ground but in the fragile, unreliable landscape of human memory. The case refused to settle, and with every passing month it felt less like an investigation and more like a haunting, because the confession had done the one thing no piece of evidence ever managed to do. It reminded everyone how close the truth might have been all along, and how easily it could still slip away. Detectives began to feel the weight of years pressing down on them, the sense that time itself was the most uncooperative witness of all, erasing traces, dulling recollections, softening sharp edges until nothing fit cleanly anymore. They turned to geography, to the land itself, treating Florida not as a backdrop, but as a suspect. In 1992, the area had been wilder, less developed, its empty spaces vast and forgiving. What was now a shopping plaza had once been scrub and sand. What was now a gated community had been swamp thick enough to swallow sound. Old maps were pulled, aerial photographs spread across tables, transparencies layered to show what had changed and what hadn't. The confession named places that no longer existed in the same form, making verification a race against bulldozers and memory. Searches resumed in pockets untouched by development, stretches of land that had escaped concrete and fences. Crews moved slowly, methodically, aware that hope could not outrun reality. Each dig brought anticipation, The unspoken thought that this time might be different. Each dig ended the same way. The earth gave nothing back. The silence after every failed search grew heavier, as if the ground itself was mocking their persistence. The focus shifted again, this time toward the days immediately following the disappearance, those critical hours when decisions had been made under pressure. Investigators scrutinized their predecessors' choices, not with blame but with necessity. Why had certain tips been deprioritized? Why had one witness been dismissed as unreliable? Why had another never been followed up at all? The answers lay partly in the limits of the time, partly in human judgment, and partly in the uncomfortable truth that some cases slip through cracks no one notices until it's too late. One tip resurfaced, buried deep in the file, barely a paragraph long. An anonymous call made days after the disappearance, describing a vehicle seen late at night near a remote area. The caller unsure whether it mattered. At the time, it had been logged and set aside, overshadowed by louder, more dramatic leads. Now, with the confession casting doubt instead of clarity, that forgotten detail took on new weight. Investigators tracked the location, compared it to the confessor's story. It didn't match. It pointed somewhere else entirely. Another witness, contacted again after years of silence, admitted something they hadn't before. Back then, they'd been afraid, unsure whether what they knew would put them at risk. Now older, with less to lose, they spoke hesitantly of a person seen with the victim days before she vanished, someone not mentioned in the confession, someone whose name barely appeared in the file. The information was vague, frustratingly so, but it cracked open a door that had long been closed. This was the danger of the confession. It had narrowed focus at a moment when the case needed expansion. By centering the narrative on one man, one story, it risked eclipsing everything else. Detectives fought that pull, reminding themselves that truth rarely arrives neatly packaged. They widened the lens again, revisiting every name, every scenario, even those that felt improbable. Pressure intensified from the outside. The longer the uncertainty lasted, the more critics accused law enforcement of incompetence or indecision. Social media dissected every update, every leaked detail, turning speculation into certainty and doubt into accusation. Armchair detectives built theories, some elaborate, some reckless, many accusing the wrong people with absolute confidence. The case was no longer just an investigation. It was a public spectacle, distorted by attention and impatience. For the family, this phase was the hardest. Hope had been raised and shaken, only to be left trembling. They attended meetings, listened to explanations filled with caveats and qualifiers, learned to read between the lines. They understood more than most how fragile the situation was, but understanding didn't ease the pain. Every delay felt like another loss. Inside the department, morale wavered. Younger detectives, brought in for fresh perspective, struggled with the emotional gravity of a case that predated their careers. Veterans carried the weight of unfinished business, of faces they could still picture, voices they could still hear. The confession had promised relief, but instead it deepened the sense of responsibility. Behavioral analysts returned to the question no one could answer definitively. Why confess now? If the man was responsible, why wait until death? Guilt was one explanation, but not the only one. There was also control, the desire to shape the story, to leave a mark, or confusion, memory altered by illness, by medication, by years of unspoken regret. The analysts warned against certainty. A confession without evidence, they said, was just another clue, not the conclusion. As the first anniversary of the confession approached, the case stood at a crossroads. Officially, it remained open. Unofficially, exhaustion crept in. Resources were finite. Attention drifted. Other cases demanded priority. The risk was not that the truth would never be found, but that the pursuit of it would slowly, quietly fade again. And yet, despite everything, the case still breathed. Not loudly, not urgently, but stubbornly. In forgotten tips, in altered landscapes, in memories loosened by time and age. The confession had not solved the mystery. It had exposed its complexity, reminding everyone that some crimes don't end when someone speaks, but when every silence has been accounted for. In Florida, 1992, still held too many silences to ignore. By the time investigators reached what they quietly called the second winter of the confession, the case had taken on a new texture, heavier, slower, less about momentum and more about endurance, because whatever spark the dying man's words had ignited was now buried under layers of doubt, paperwork, and the relentless passage of time. The headlines had moved on, but inside the department the file remained open on desks and screens, its presence constant, like a low hum you only notice when it stops. They began reconstructing the victim's life in finer detail than ever before, not just the last day, but the weeks leading up to it. The subtle shifts that might have gone unnoticed at the time. Bank records were examined again, not for large transactions, but for patterns, changes in routine, places she visited more often, places she stopped going entirely. Phone logs were reinterpreted with modern analytical tools, looking for anomalies in call frequency, gaps that suggested conversations that never made it to paper. It was an attempt to hear echoes in data that had long since gone quiet. Friends are asked questions they had never been asked before. Not what happened, but how things felt. Whether she seemed distracted, worried, preoccupied. Some remembered small things, a canceled plan, a vague comment about being watched, an argument brushed off as trivial. At the time, none of it had registered as danger. In hindsight, every detail felt loaded, every memory a potential warning sign missed. The confession loomed over these interviews, unspoken but present. People adjusted their stories, consciously or not, to fit what they had heard. Investigators had to constantly recalibrate, reminding themselves that memory is porous, that narratives contaminate recollection. They documented everything meticulously, marking what was original and what might have been influenced by decades of retelling. One thread began to stand out, thin but persistent, a name that appeared on the edges of the victim's life, never central, never obvious, but recurring enough to raise questions. Someone she had interacted with sporadically, someone whose presence spiked briefly in the weeks before she vanished, then disappeared from her orbit entirely. The confession did not mention this person. The original investigation had noted the connection but moved on, unable to establish motive or opportunity. Now, with fresh eyes, the thread felt worth pulling. Investigators tracked the individual down, finding a life that had changed dramatically since 1992. Different state, different name, spelling, a history that looked ordinary on the surface, but riddled with gaps. When interviewed, the person was cooperative, almost eager, answering questions with rehearsed calm. They acknowledged knowing the victim, downplayed the extent of the relationship, dismissed the timing as coincidence. Their alibi for the day in question was vague, relying on memories as old and unreliable as everyone else's. Nothing stuck, nothing broke. Still, something felt off. Not enough to accuse, not enough to act on, but enough to keep the name from being crossed out again. The case was full of those names, people who hovered in the gray space between suspicion and irrelevance, reminders that not every story resolves cleanly. Meanwhile, the confession continued to exert a strange gravitational pull. Some investigators found themselves returning to it repeatedly, listening again for something they might have missed, a slip of the tongue, an emotional cue, a detail that could be anchored to reality. Each listen brought something new and nothing definitive. The man's words were a maze, and the more they traced its paths, the more disoriented they became. Behavioral experts revisited their assessments, this time focusing less on whether the man believed what he was saying, and more on why the story took the shape it did. They noted how he positioned himself as both actor and observer, how he minimized certain actions while emphasizing others, how he framed events as inevitable rather than chosen. It suggested guilt, yes, but guilt did not automatically equal responsibility for the specific crime. Guilt could attach itself to many things, including silence, knowledge withheld, or involvement that stopped short of what he implied. That possibility opened a new, unsettling line of inquiry. What if the confession was not a full admission, but a partial one? What if the man had been present, involved peripherally, or aware of something crucial, without being the sole perpetrator? The theory complicated everything. It explained inconsistencies without resolving them. It raised the specter of accomplices long gone, of decisions made collectively and hidden individually. The idea was disturbing, not just because it expanded the suspect pool, but because it suggested the truth might be fragmented beyond repair. If responsibility was shared, and if those involved were dead, untraceable, or protected by time, the case might never reach the clarity everyone wanted. Externally, patients wore thin. Calls for transparency grew louder. Advocacy groups demanded answers, accountability, an explanation for why a case so close to resolution seemed to stall. Officials responded with careful statements, emphasizing diligence over speed, truth over optics. It satisfied few. In the public imagination, the story had already been written once, and rewriting it felt like failure. For the family, the shifting narrative was a quiet torment. They lived in a perpetual state of almost knowing, attending briefings that offered movement without a rival. Each theory brought a surge of emotion followed by a crash. They learned the language of investigations, the meaning behind phrases like active lead and under review, and they learned how easily those phrases could stretch into years. Inside the department, conversations grew more philosophical. What did solving a case really mean? A conviction? A body? A confession backed by proof? Or was it enough to narrow the truth, to say with confidence what happened, even if the law could no longer act? There were no easy answers, only competing definitions of justice. As the case entered its fourth decade, it felt suspended between eras, anchored in 1992, but shaped by modern scrutiny, digital analysis, and a public that refused to let it fade quietly. The confession had altered the landscape, but it had not revealed the terrain beneath. Instead, it forced everyone to confront a harder reality, that some mysteries deepen when disturbed, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a dying man can leave behind is not the truth itself, but a story compelling enough to distract from it, leaving Florida's most enduring cold case still breathing, still unresolved, and still waiting for the one piece that would finally make the past stop shifting. The longer the case stayed open, the more it began to feel like it was resisting resolution on purpose, as if every attempt to pin it down only made it slip further into shadow, because by now the investigation was no longer chasing a single moment in 1992. It was chasing 30 years of silence layered on top of one another. Detectives started talking less about answers and more about pressure points, places where the truth might surface if pushed the right way. And that meant returning yet again to the people who had lived closest to the edges of the story. They re-examined the victim's final known movements minute by minute, stripping the day down to its barest structure. Morning routines, привычные stops, short conversations that once seemed meaningless. The goal was not to confirm what they already believed, but to challenge it, to ask whether the accepted version of events had become too comfortable, too rehearsed. The confession had reshaped the narrative, but perhaps the narrative itself had been flawed from the start. One detail, long dismissed as coincidence, began to feel heavier under scrutiny: the timing of a missed appointment, something the victim had never skipped before. At the time, it had been chalked up to traffic, distraction, chance. Now investigators wondered if it marked the true beginning of whatever went wrong, a moment when her routine fractured just enough for someone else to step in. They traced who knew about that appointment, who might have expected her there, who noticed her absence before the alarm was officially raised. This led them back to a familiar problem. Too many people knew too much, and none of it aligned cleanly. Small communities breed overlap. Lives intersect in ways that look innocent until they don't. The case was full of those intersections, connections that never rose to the level of evidence, but never fully disappeared either. Meanwhile, the confession continued to echo, its presence unavoidable. Even when detectives tried to work around it, it shaped their thinking, pulling focus back toward the man who could no longer clarify or contradict his own words. His story had become a fixed point in an otherwise fluid investigation, and that rigidity was dangerous. The risk wasn't believing him completely. The risk was letting his version define the boundaries of what felt possible. A breakthrough seemed to come from an unexpected direction. Not a new witness, not a recovered object, but a reanalysis of old communication records using modern behavioral modeling. Patterns emerged that had been invisible before. Calls clustered in strange ways. Brief, repeated contacts between people whose connection had never been fully explored. None of it proved a crime, but it suggested coordination, or at least awareness. Something that complicated the lone actor narrative implied by the confession. Detectives followed this thread carefully, knowing how fragile it was. They mapped social networks from the early 90s, a painstaking process that relied on interviews, documents, and educated inference rather than digital footprints. It was slow, imperfect, and deeply human work. Names began to cluster, some familiar, some forgotten. The picture that emerged was messy, crowded, nothing like the clean arc promised by a deathbed admission. As this broader theory took shape, internal tension grew. Some investigators worried the case was becoming too speculative, that without physical evidence, they were drifting into conjecture. Others argued that speculation, when grounded in data and pattern, was the only way forward left to them. The debate wasn't about ego. It was about how far you could stretch an investigation before it snapped. Outside the department, patience eroded further. Every delay fed suspicion. Some accused law enforcement of backtracking, of quietly admitting they had rushed to judgment when the confession first surfaced. Others believed the truth was being protected, hidden behind bureaucracy and careful language. The louder the speculation became, the harder it was to work in silence. And silence was exactly what the case demanded. The family found themselves in a strange position, both central to the story and powerless within it. They were consulted, informed, briefed, but never given certainty. They heard theories rise and fall, watched names appear in the news only to vanish weeks later. The confession, once a source of grim hope, had become a source of anger, not because it existed, but because it promised what it could not deliver. Privately, some detectives began to voice a fear they rarely admitted out loud, that the case might be unsolvable in the traditional sense, that the truth, even if partially known, might never be proven beyond doubt. It was a thought that felt like failure, but also like realism. Cold cases did not owe anyone neat endings. They only offered persistence. Still, no one was ready to stop. Not yet. The investigation narrowed again, this time focusing on a short window after the disappearance when several individual stories overlapped in unusual ways. Travel records, work schedules, and personal accounts suggested a convergence that had never been fully examined. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. Interviews resumed. Carefully, strategically, detectives avoided mentioning the confession unless necessary, allowing subjects to speak without the weight of that narrative shaping their responses. Inconsistencies appeared, not dramatic, but telling. Hesitations, corrections, phrases repeated as if memorized. Nothing actionable on its own, but enough to suggest that the official story of that day, whatever it was, had never been fully honest. And yet, every time momentum seemed to build, it stalled against the same barrier. No body, no definitive scene, no single piece of evidence that could anchor theory to reality. The case existed in fragments, each one plausible, none of them complete. As another year closed, the investigation reached a quiet, critical point. Not a climax, not a conclusion, but a reckoning. Resources were reviewed, priorities reassessed. The the case would continue, but differently, more surgically, more selectively. The goal shifted from solving to understanding, from closure to clarity. However limited that clarity might be, the confession, once framed as an ending, now sat where it truly belonged. As one voice among many, neither dismissed nor believed outright. A haunting reminder that truth is not always revealed in final words, and that sometimes the most dangerous lies are not spoken with malice, but with conviction. Florida, 1992, remained unresolved, its mystery reshaped but intact. A case defined not by what had been said at the end, but by everything that still refused to speak. The investigation entered a quieter phase, not because it had lost urgency, but because noise had proven dangerous, and every headline, every leaked detail seemed to harden positions rather than loosen the truth. Detectives worked behind closed doors, guided by a single question that now defined the case more than any confession ever had. What if the story everyone believed was only a shadow of what really happened? That question stripped away assumptions and forced them to look again at the case, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a structure built over time, layered with errors, omissions, and human fear. They began with fear, because fear explained more than guilt ever could. In 1992, fear shaped what people said and what they kept to themselves. Fear of being wrong, fear of being involved, fear of retaliation, fear of becoming the next headline. Investigators cataloged moments where fear might have altered behavior: a witness who hesitated before calling police, a neighbor who chose silence over suspicion, a coworker who noticed something strange and decided it wasn't their place to intervene. None of it was criminal. All of it mattered. One interview stood out, not for what was said, but for how long it had been delayed. A person who had lived near the area where the car was found, someone who had never formally spoken to law enforcement. Back then, they convinced themselves they had nothing useful to offer. Now, decades later, memory returned in fragments, uncertain but persistent. A sound late at night, a vehicle stopping, then leaving, a sense that something was aright, followed by the decision to go back inside and lock the door. The details were thin, but the timing conflicted with the confession, pushing events later into the night, into hours the dying man had barely mentioned. That discrepancy mattered. It suggested movement after the moment the confession claimed everything was over. It hinted at more than one phase, more than one decision point. The idea unsettled investigators because it implied complexity, and complexity was the enemy of closure. As they layered these fragments together, a pattern began to emerge. Not a clean narrative, but a rhythm. The disappearance did not feel impulsive anymore. It felt managed. The abandoned car, once seen as a panic mistake, now looked intentional, a signal placed where it would be found quickly, diverting attention while something else unfolded elsewhere. It was a theory, nothing more, but it fit too many details to ignore. The confession strained under this interpretation. The man had described chaos, fear, a loss of control, but the evidence, such as it was, pointed toward planning, or at least adaptation. Someone had made choices that required calm, time, and awareness of how investigations worked. The question shifted again, sharper this time. If the confessor wasn't the architect of what happened, what role did he play? And why had he chosen to speak when he did? Behavioral analysts revisited motive with renewed intensity. They noted how the confession framed responsibility without consequence, how it placed the speaker at the center of the story while removing others entirely. It was, they argued, a confession that simplified reality. Simplification could be mercy. It could also be misdirection. Another troubling possibility surfaced. What if the confession was not meant to reveal the truth, but to contain it? By offering himself as the answer, the man might have been closing doors rather than opening them, ensuring that certain questions were never asked again. It was an unsettling thought, one that cast the confession not as an act of conscience, but as a final exertion of control. Investigators tread carefully around that idea. It was dangerous territory, easy to slide into cynicism. Still, the timing nagged at them. The man had waited decades. He had watched investigations stall, watched attention fade. Only when the case was truly cold, when other participants might be dead or unreachable, did he speak. Whether intentional or not, the effect was the same. The confession redirected focus onto a single voice that could no longer be challenged. Meanwhile, the broader theory gained quiet traction, not officially, not publicly, but in working notes and late-night conversations. The case, they began to believe, involved more than one person, not necessarily conspirators, but individuals whose small choices intersected in a way that produced a catastrophic outcome. No single villain, no simple explanation, just a sequence of decisions, some reckless, some self-preserving, all of them irreversible. This perspective changed how interviews were conducted. Detectives stopped asking who did it and started asking who knew what and when. The shift was subtle but powerful. People who had been defensive before relaxed slightly, answering questions about knowledge rather than blame. Timelines adjusted. Overlaps appeared. It wasn't enough to prove a crime, but it was enough to reveal that the official story of ignorance didn't hold. The public, unaware of these nuances, grew restless again. Without updates, speculation filled the gap. Online theories hardened into belief. Some clung to the confession as gospel, angry at any suggestion it might be incomplete. Others rejected it entirely, convinced it was a lie designed to protect someone else. The truth, buried somewhere between those extremes, remained inaccessible. For the family, this stage brought a new kind of grief. Not the shock of loss, not even the ache of uncertainty, but the slow realization that the truth might never be singular, never something that could be summarized in a sentence or proven in court. They listened to explanations about complexity and probability, about how cases sometimes end without endings. It was not what they wanted. It was what they were being offered. Inside the department, leadership faced a choice. They could narrow the case again, declare the confession sufficient, and allow history to settle into a simpler shape. Or they could continue down this harder path, one that might lead to understanding without resolution, to answers without justice. The decision was not announced. It was implied, reflected in budgets approved and denied, in assignments extended or reassigned. The case would continue, but it would no longer chase headlines. As the investigation pressed on quietly, one truth became unavoidable. The confession had changed everything, not by solving the case, but by exposing how fragile certainty really was. It had forced everyone to confront the possibility that the most important answers were never spoken aloud, that they lived instead in the spaces between stories, in the silences people carried for years because speaking felt more dangerous than staying quiet. Florida, 1992, was no longer just a cold case warmed by a dramatic ending. It was a mirror held up to memory, fear, and a human need for narrative. And somewhere within that mirror, distorted but persistent, the outline of what really happened continued to flicker, refusing to come fully into focus, reminding everyone that some truths don't reveal themselves all at once, and some confessions, no matter how dramatic, are only the beginning of a much deeper silence. By the eighth movement of the story, the case no longer felt like it belonged to a single year or a single crime. It felt like a long echo moving through time, changing shape as it bounced off new information and old regrets, because what investigators were really confronting now was not just what happened in Florida in 1992, but how that moment had been rewritten again and again by everyone who touched it. The disappearance had become a living thing, sustained by silence, shaped by partial truths, kept alive by the refusal to accept that a confession, however dramatic, could substitute for certainty. Behind closed doors, the investigation shifted once more, this time toward intent rather than action. Not who physically caused the disappearance, but who benefited from the confusion that followed. It was a dangerous question, one that forced detectives to consider uncomfortable possibilities. Chaos is not always accidental. Sometimes it is useful. Sometimes it protects people who never appear in headlines, whose involvement is indirect but decisive. They reviewed the immediate aftermath again, hour by hour, focusing not on law enforcement responses, but on civilian behavior. Who spoke quickly, who stayed silent, who inserted themselves into the search effort with unusual enthusiasm, who quietly withdrew. Patterns emerged that had been invisible before, obscured by the urgency of those early days. Some people had known exactly when to disappear from view. Others had known precisely when to be seen. One name resurfaced in this analysis, not as a suspect in the traditional sense, but as a constant presence near key moments. Someone who had access, knowledge, and reason to avoid attention. Their connection to the victim was indirect but meaningful, rooted in obligation rather than affection. The confession did not account for this person at all. In fact, it erased them from the story entirely. That absence was now impossible to ignore. Investigators approached carefully, aware that time had given this individual distance and protection. Memories were hazy, records incomplete. When interviewed, the person presented as cooperative, even sympathetic, expressing shock and sadness, repeating phrases that had been used by others over the years. But there was a rehearsed quality to the responses, a careful avoidance of specifics, a tendency to redirect conversations back toward the confession, as if anchoring themselves to the officially accepted narrative offered safety. This was where the case became most fragile. Without hard evidence, everything rested on interpretation, tone, timing, behavior. It was easy to see patterns where none existed. It was equally easy to miss them where they did. Detectives debated endlessly, pushing and pulling against each other's instincts, trying to balance skepticism with imagination. The confession, meanwhile, took on a new role. It was no longer a potential solution. It was a filter, a lens through which every new detail had to pass. Some information aligned with it. Some contradicted it. Some seemed to exist entirely outside its boundaries. That last category grew larger with time, and it was the most troubling of all. The man's recorded words were played again, this time with a different purpose. Investigators listened not for facts, but for omissions. What he never mentioned, what he glossed over, what he rushed past. The gap spoke loudly. He described events as if they unfolded in isolation, disconnected from the wider social web the victim lived in. It was a version of reality stripped of context, and that stripping now felt intentional. A theory emerged, cautiously, reluctantly. The confession might have been true in parts and false in purpose. Not a lie, but a diversion, a way to absorb responsibility without exposing the full scope of what happened. If others had been involved indirectly, if knowledge had been shared quietly, then a single, unchallengeable confession would serve everyone's interests, especially if the confessor was dying. This theory was impossible to prove, but it explained too much to dismiss. It explained why the confession came so late, why it was detailed but incomplete, why it resolved public pressure while complicating private investigation. It explained why certain people seemed relieved when the headlines declared the case solved. Relief, in this context, was suspicious. As these ideas took shape, the investigation became quieter still. Fewer interviews, more analysis, more time spent thinking rather than acting. It was a dangerous phase, one where cases sometimes die not from lack of leads, but from the weight of too many possibilities. Every step had to be justified, every assumption challenged. The family sensed the shift, even without being told. Updates became more abstract, less definitive. Words like probable and suggestive replaced promising. They asked direct questions and received careful answers. It was clear that the case was not moving toward a courtroom, but towards something less tangible. Understanding, perhaps, or acceptance. Publicly, the case faded again. New crimes claimed attention. New tragedies replaced old ones. Only occasionally did the story resurface, usually framed as a cautionary tale about false confessions or the limits of justice. Each time, the headline flattened years of complexity into a few lines, and each time, investigators felt the familiar frustration of seeing a living, breathing investigation reduced to a narrative convenience. Privately, doubts hardened into quiet convictions, not about who did it, but about how wrong the original framing had been. The disappearance was no longer seen as a single act, but as a process, a chain of moments where intervention might have changed everything. A missed question, a delayed call, a decision to stay silent. Responsibility, in this light, was diffuse, spread across time and people, impossible to assign cleanly. This realization was both freeing and devastating. Freeing, because it released the case from the impossible demand of certainty. Devastating, because it meant the truth might never be distilled into something the legal system could recognize. The confession, dramatic as it was, had offered a false sense of finality. The deeper truth resisted that kind of closure. As the investigation pressed on in this narrowed, reflective state, one conclusion became unavoidable. The disappearance had not been forgotten because it was unsolvable. It had endured because it touched something fundamental, the fear that ordinary lives can fracture without warning, and that even when someone speaks at the end, even when a voice claims to explain everything, the real story may already be too scattered to recover. Florida, 1992, now existed in a space beyond resolution. Not cold, not solved, not closed. It was a case defined by its aftershocks, by the way one moment continued to ripple through decades, reshaped by memory, fear, and the human hunger for endings. And as long as those ripples remained, the mystery remained too, not screaming for attention anymore, but whispering persistently, a reminder that some truths don't disappear when someone confesses. They simply retreat deeper into the silence that made them possible in the first place. By the ninth stretch of this long unraveling, the case had become something investigators no longer spoke about in terms of victory or defeat, but in terms of gravity, because it pulled everything toward it, every decision, every doubt, every quiet moment when someone wondered whether truth was still a destination or just a direction. Florida, 1992, had stopped being a year on a file tab and started being a presence, lingering in hallways, surfacing in conversations that began about other cases and ended, inevitably, here. What changed now was not evidence, but tone. The investigation shed its last illusions of a dramatic reveal and leaned fully into restraint. Detectives began documenting not just what they believed, but what they could never know, drawing clear lines between fact, inference, and absence. It was a way of protecting the case from myth, from the temptation to fill silence with certainty. In some ways, it was the most honest phase yet. They assembled a comprehensive chronology, not just of the disappearance, but of the investigation itself. Every major decision, every pivot, every moment when a lead was elevated or dismissed. This meta-timeline revealed patterns that had been invisible when events were viewed in isolation. Bursts of activity followed by long lulls. Moments when outside pressure influenced internal focus. Times when the case narrowed too quickly, then widened too late. It was uncomfortable to see, but necessary. Within this framework, the confession found its true place. Not as an endpoint, not even as a turning point, but as a disruption. It had injected urgency into a case that had grown quiet, but it had also distorted priorities, compressing complexity into a single narrative arc that never quite fit. Seen this way, the confession was neither salvation nor sabotage. It was an event, one that had to be understood rather than accepted. Investigators revisited the days after the confession broke, analyzing their own reactions. How quickly had they leaned in? How much did they want it to be true? Those questions mattered, because desire is a powerful force in cold cases. The longer a mystery endures, the more tempting any answer becomes. A confession from a dying man felt like a gift. Now it felt like a test they hadn't fully anticipated. Quietly, without announcement, the case file was reorganized. The confessor's narrative was separated from the core evidentiary record, placed alongside other unverified accounts rather than above them. It was a symbolic move, but symbols matter. It signaled a return to balance, a refusal to let one voice outweigh decades of unanswered questions. New interviews were rare now, but when they happened, they were different. Detectives asked fewer questions and listened longer. They let silences stretch. They allowed people to talk themselves into corners or out of them. Without the pressure of immediate resolution, conversations became more revealing. People corrected themselves, contradicted earlier statements, admitted uncertainty. These weren't confessions. They were fractures, small but telling. One such fracture appeared in a conversation that had nothing to do with the victim at first. A former acquaintance, speaking about life in the early 90s, casually mentioned how certain people knew when not to ask questions. It was said offhand, almost nostalgically, but it landed hard. That sentence captured something investigators had struggled to articulate. The disappearance existed in a culture of selective awareness, where knowing too much could be as dangerous as knowing nothing at all. This understanding reframed the case yet again. It wasn't just about what happened to one woman. It was about a community's unspoken rules, about how silence can be communal, maintained not by conspiracy, but by mutual avoidance. In that context, the lack of witnesses, the thinness of leads, the enduring gaps all made a different kind of sense. The abandoned car, revisited endlessly, took on new meaning. It was no longer just evidence. It was a message, intentional or not, that anchored the story in a place people could see, allowing everything else to remain hidden. Attention fixed on that parking spot, those unlocked doors, while whatever truly mattered unfolded elsewhere, unseen and unspoken. The confession tried to reclaim that narrative, to pull everything back to a single act, a single person, a single moment. But reality resisted. Too many lives intersected around the edges. Too many small choices accumulated into something irreversible. If the confessor had been involved, his role now seemed less like a beginning and more like a midpoint, a junction where paths crossed and then diverged. This ambiguity unsettled everyone, especially those who had hoped the case would end cleanly. Some investigators admitted privately that they felt grief not just for the victim, but for the idea of resolution itself. They had imagined a moment when the story would stop, when files could be closed with confidence. Now they understood that some cases don't end. They simply change form. The family, informed with careful honesty, responded in different ways. Some clung to the confession, preferring an imperfect answer to endless uncertainty. Others accepted the complexity, finding a strange peace in knowing that the truth was larger than any single explanation. None of it erased the loss. It only altered how it was carried. Public interest flickered unpredictably. A podcast episode reignited discussion. A documentary teaser promised revelations that never quite arrived. Each resurgence brought new speculation, new accusations, new confidence from people far removed from the case. Investigators learned to let it pass. They had reached a point where public certainty no longer dictated private direction. Internally, the case was no longer measured by progress, but by integrity. Was every claim supported? Was every assumption challenged? Were they honest about what they did not know? These questions guided decisions more than deadlines ever could. It was slower. It was quieter. It was also the only way forward that felt respectful to the truth. As another year approached its end, a final internal report was drafted, not to close the case, but to preserve it accurately for the future. It outlined competing theories without choosing between them. It documented the confession with context and caution. It acknowledged investigative missteps without defensiveness. It was, in essence, a refusal to simplify history for comfort's sake. The report concluded with an observation rather than a verdict. That the disappearance in Florida in 1992 could not be reduced to a single moment of violence or a single voice claiming responsibility. That it was shaped by environment, by relationships, by fear, by silence. That understanding it required accepting uncertainty as part of the truth, not a failure to reach it. And so the case continued, not loudly, not urgently, but faithfully, a living record of what happens when answers arrive too late, when memories blur, when confession collides with reality, and neither fully survives the impact. Florida, 1992, remained unresolved, not because no one cared enough to solve it, but because the truth itself had been fractured by time, scattered across decades and people, leaving behind not a single story, but a constellation of shadows, each one pointing towards something real, and none of them bright enough to stand alone. The confession never sleeps. Even as years pass, it keeps breathing somewhere in the back of the case file. A single page that refuses to yellow, a voice recorded on brittle tape that investigators can never quite turn off. By the time the calendar flips into the early 2000s, the Florida 1992 cold case has become something else entirely. Not just an unsolved murder, not just a missing life. It has become a permanent scar in the memory of the town, a reference point, a before and after that no one can escape. New detectives cycle in, younger, sharper, trained with better tools, digital databases, forensic software that didn't exist when the body was found. They listen to the tapes. They read the statements. They stare at the confession made from a deathbed that should have ended everything, and instead poisoned it with doubt. Because the more technology advances, the more that confession begins to look less like an ending and more like a disruption. A stone dropped into still water that never stops making ripples. One investigator, assigned to the case nearly a decade after the original crime, notices something no one else had pushed hard enough. The timeline. The confession insists on a precise sequence of movements, a route taken through back roads, a stop that was never mentioned before. It sounds confident. Too confident. When the route is reconstructed using modern mapping software, the drive times don't line up. Not by minutes. By nearly half an hour. At first, it's dismissed. Memory degrades. Dying men misremember. But the discrepancy nags. Half an hour is not a small error. Half an hour is a window. Half an hour is enough time for someone else to act, to intervene, to disappear. The investigator flags it, writes a memo. It goes unanswered for months. Meanwhile, the victim's family is still waiting. They have aged into their grief. Photographs on the walls show faces that no longer exist in the mirror. They have learned to measure time not by holidays, but by anniversaries of silence. When the confession first surfaced, it hit them like a second death. Shock, then hope, then confusion. Closure was promised in whispers and headlines, but never delivered. Each year that passes without charges feels like a betrayal that has no face, no one to scream at. The family begins to wonder if the truth is being protected, not discovered. The town has changed too. Strip malls replace empty lots. Roads widen. New houses stand where woods once swallowed sound, but some places remain frozen. The stretch of road where the victim was last seen still feels wrong at night. Locals avoid it without discussing why. It's not superstition. It's memory embedded in asphalt. Teenagers who weren't even born in 1992 know the story in fragments, distorted, passed down like an urban legend. A disappearance, a body, a confession, a question mark that never went away. Then a box resurfaces. Not evidence, not exactly. A storage container misfiled during an office move, opened years later by accident. Inside are tapes, old interview tapes. Some were logged, some were not. Among them is a voice no one remembers interviewing. A man who lived 2 streets away from the crime scene in 1992. He was questioned briefly, then dismissed. On the tape, his voice trembles when he talks about that night. He mentions hearing an argument, raised voices, A car idling longer than it should have. He gives a description that almost matches the confessed suspect's vehicle, but not quite. Different color, different sound. The tape ends abruptly. No follow-up interview is documented. The discovery sends a quiet jolt through the department. Not excitement, unease. Because if this tape was overlooked, what else was missed? The confession is replayed again, this time with new ears. The words don't change, but their weight does. Certain details feel borrowed, like they were learned secondhand. Information that was not public at the time, yet oddly generic. Investigators begin to ask the question they avoided for years. Did the man on the deathbed confess because he was guilty, or because he wanted to be remembered as something more than what he was? Psychological profilers weigh in. False confessions are not unheard of, especially at the end of life. Guilt, attention, confusion, the desire to control a narrative before death erases everything. The confession had no physical evidence to anchor it. No object recovered. No location confirmed. Just words. Words that had been powerful enough to stall the case, but not strong enough to close it. As this internal doubt grows, it never reaches the public. Officially, the case remains in limbo, described in careful language, neither solved nor reopened. But inside the department, the air has shifted. Detectives quietly revisit old suspects. Names that were once crossed out are penciled back in. One of them has a connection no one emphasized before. A personal dispute with the victim weeks before the disappearance. Another had access to a vehicle matching the witness tape. Another left the state abruptly in 1993. None of it is enough. All of it is unsettling. The deathbed confessor is gone, buried. His words etched into transcripts that cannot defend themselves. His family refuses interviews. They say he told the truth. They say he wanted peace. They say reopening the case dishonors his final act. But law enforcement knows something uncomfortable now. The confession solved nothing. It merely rearranged the shadows. Years pass again. Technology advances again. DNA databases explode in size. Cold cases across the country are cracked open by microscopic traces and chance familial matches. Hope flickers. Evidence from the Florida case is retested. Results come back inconclusive. Too degraded. Too contaminated. Time has done what violence started. It has erased clarity. And yet, the case refuses to die. It lingers in training manuals, in internal discussions about investigative bias. New detectives are warned about it. A lesson disguised as a mystery. Don't anchor too soon. Don't fall in love with a confession. Don't mistake noise for truth. The file becomes heavier with commentary than with evidence. The victim's name still appears in local newspapers every few years, usually in the same context. Anniversary, remembrance, unanswered questions. Each article ends the same way, with a line that sounds almost apologetic. No arrests have been made. The community remains haunted. The family remains hopeful. The truth remains unknown. Late at night, in the quiet of the records room, a detective listens to the confession again. Not as proof, as a performance. The pauses, the emphasis, the moments where the voice strains, not with sorrow, but with certainty. It feels rehearsed, or maybe it just feels human. The detective stops the tape. In the silence, the weight of the case presses down. Somewhere, the real sequence of events still exists, intact, untouched by statements or speculation. It exists in reality, not paper, and that reality has never been fully reached. Outside, Florida keeps moving. Sunlight, tourists, traffic, life layered over death, until the outline is almost invisible. Almost, but not quite, because some cases don't want to be solved. They want to be remembered. They want to linger as warnings, as questions, as open wounds that never close cleanly. And as long as the confession sits there, unresolved and proven, it will continue to do what it has always done best: distract, disturb, and whisper that the truth is still somewhere else, waiting, patient, unfinished. The final years bring no resolution, only a sharpening of the silence. By the time the case reaches its third decade, the file has grown thick with annotations, cross-references, digital printouts layered over yellowing paper like sediment. Each generation of investigators adds its own handwriting to the margins, questions written smaller, tighter, as if afraid to take up space that does not belong to answers. The Florida 1992 cold case is no longer just an investigation. It is an inheritance, passed down, unfinished, heavy. One last review is ordered quietly, not announced, not publicized. No press releases, no promises. Just a final attempt before the case is formally archived. Not closed, never closed, but set aside. The lead detective assigned this task knows what that means. Archiving is the slow burial of hope under procedure. He approaches the file without ceremony, without expectation, only with the discipline of someone who has learned not to trust endings. He listens to every tape again, reads every statement out loud, forcing the words to exist in air instead of ink. Sometimes patterns reveal themselves only when sound replaces sight. He notices something small, almost nothing, a phrase repeated across different interviews, years apart, by different people who should not have shared language. The same odd description of a sound that night. Not a scream, not a crash. A low, mechanical whine, sustained, unnatural. It appears in 3 statements. One was dismissed as imagination. Another was never followed up. The third came from the deathbed confessor himself, buried in a longer answer, mentioned casually, as if unimportant. The detective pauses the recording, rewinds, plays it again. The whine does not belong in the official narrative. It never did. He traces it backward. Old police logs, utility records, construction permits. In 1992, near the crime scene, a piece of equipment was temporarily installed for road work. Portable, loud, capable of masking other sounds. It was removed days later. No one connected it to the case at the time. Why would they? Noise is everywhere. But now the detail glows faintly, like an ember that refuses to die. The detective builds a theory in his head, careful not to fall in love with it. The equipment could explain the lack of witnesses, the timing, the window that never quite closed. It could also explain why the confession's timeline felt wrong, because the night did not unfold the way anyone thought. He brings the finding to his superiors. They listen. They nod. They say the right things. And then they say the hardest thing. There is nothing left to test it against. No physical evidence. No living witnesses willing to speak. No suspect who can be placed there with certainty. The law does not move on theories. The law moves on proof. The theory is filed, carefully, respectfully, and quietly. The victim's family is informed that the case will be archived. Not solved, not abandoned, archived. The word lands like a closing door that doesn't slam, but doesn't reopen either. They have heard every version of hope. This one sounds different. It sounds final. They ask the same question they have asked for years. Do you know what happened? The answer does not change. We believe we are closer. We cannot say how close. We cannot say when. We cannot say if. At home, the family removes nothing from the walls. The photographs stay. The candle is still lit on anniversaries. Grief has become part of the architecture of their lives. It no longer screams. It hums. Constant. Low. Like a machine running somewhere nearby, impossible to shut off. The confession remains in the file, unchanged. It is neither validated nor disproven. It exists in a strange legal limbo, powerful enough to influence the case, weak enough to collapse under scrutiny. Some investigators still believe it. Others never will. The truth is, no one knows what the man on the deathbed really carried with him when he died. Guilt, knowledge, lies, or just words shaped by fear of disappearing without impact. The town barely notices when the case is archived. New scandals replace old ones. New tragedies demand attention. But every so often, usually late at night, someone will search the case online. They will read the same headlines. Florida, 1992, cold case. Confession from a deathbed. Shocked investigators. And then they will reach the end and feel the absence where an ending should be. No conviction, no certainty, just a question mark that refuses to fade. In police training rooms, the case is mentioned without names, a cautionary tale about assumptions, about time, about how easily a single dramatic moment can derail years of careful work. Confessions are powerful, the instructors say, but power is not truth. Truth is quiet. Truth does not announce itself. Truth waits. Somewhere, the real sequence of events still exists, untouched by files or fading memory. It exists as it always has, complete and indifferent to whether it is ever known. The road, the sound, the moment when everything changed. That version of the night has never needed witnesses. It has only waited. The Florida sun continues to rise over streets that have forgotten what they once held. Cars pass over asphalt poured long after the crime. Tires humming where silence once stretched too wide. Life goes on, not because answers were found, but because time does not pause for uncertainty. And yet, beneath the motion, beneath the noise, the case remains, embedded like a fault line. This is how the story ends. Not with justice delivered, not with a confession confirmed, but with a community that learned to live beside an unanswered question. A case that taught investigators what not to trust. A family that learned how to carry absence without letting it disappear. And a truth that remains exactly where it has always been. Just out of reach, unspoken, unresolved, waiting for a moment that may never come. The case should have ended there. Archived, labeled, quietly absorbed into the background noise of history. But cold cases don't obey paperwork. They linger in places files can't reach, in conversations that trail off, in questions people ask themselves at red lights, in the uneasy feeling that something fundamental was left undone. Long after the last official review, long after the final memo is signed, the Florida 1992 cold case continues to surface in unexpected ways, like a body that refuses to stay submerged. It starts with rumors, the way it always does. A former deputy, retired and half forgotten, tells a story at a bar about a night he was told to stand down, to stop asking questions, to write less than he saw. Another man claims his father knew more than he ever admitted, that he came home shaking that night, clothes smelling like oil and metal, refusing to explain why. None of it is admissible. None of it can be verified. But rumors don't need proof to survive. They only need space. Online forums pick up the fragments. Amateur sleuths dissect transcripts, freeze-frame old news footage, map routes with obsessive precision. They argue about the confession endlessly. Some defend it with near-religious conviction. Others tear it apart line by line. The deathbed confession becomes a Rorschach test, revealing more about the believer than the truth. Each new theory promises revelation. Each one collapses under the same weight of missing evidence. One detail keeps resurfacing, though. The sound. That low, mechanical whine. People who grew up in the town start to remember it. Not from the crime, but from their childhood. Road work. Temporary machinery. A noise that blended into the night, so completely it became invisible. Invisible things are the easiest to miss. Invisible things are the hardest to unsee, once noticed. A journalist, years later, decides to write a long-form piece, not to solve the case, but to understand why it never died. He interviews detectives who are careful with their words, family members who are no longer angry but exhausted, locals who speak in half sentences. The article never accuses. It never concludes. It simply lays everything out, side by side, contradictions and all. When it's published, it doesn't explode. It sinks in slowly. Readers finish it feeling unsettled, not informed. The journalist ends his piece with a line that circulates quietly. Some crimes are not remembered because they are violent, but because they are incomplete. That incompleteness becomes their defining feature. The Florida 1992 case is no longer about who did it. It is about what happens when certainty never arrives. Years pass. Detectives retire. Family members pass away. Witnesses become names on paper instead of voices. The case outlives almost everyone connected to it. And still, it resists closure. Not because the truth is unknowable, but because it was never fully captured when it mattered most. Timing, assumptions, distractions, one confession too loud, one detail too quiet. Somewhere, perhaps in a private moment never recorded, someone knows exactly what happened that night, or knew, and carried it, and took it with them. That possibility hangs over the case like a final insult. Justice delayed is one thing. Justice buried is another. The road remains. The place remains. Ordinary now. Unremarkable. Cars pass. People walk dogs. Children grow up without ever hearing the full story. Only the vague warning tone adults use when pointing out a stretch of pavement and saying, something bad happened there once. They don't elaborate. They don't need to. This is the final truth of the Florida 1992 cold case. Not that it was solved, not that it was unsolved, but that it became something permanent. A reminder that certainty is fragile, that confessions can lie, that silence can outlast outrage, that some questions do not fade with time, they harden. And so the case remains what it has always been beneath the headlines, beneath the investigations, beneath the deathbed words that promised everything and delivered nothing. A single night, a missing piece, a community living with the echo. The story does not end because it cannot. It simply stops being told out loud, continuing instead, where cold cases always live in the end. In the space between what is known and what will never be proven, waiting unresolved, long after the last voiceover fades to silence. By the time the story reaches its fourth decade, it no longer belongs to any one department, any one family, any one version of the truth. It has slipped into a stranger place, where facts coexist with absence, where memory does investigative work that evidence never could. The Florida 1992 cold case exists now as a quiet presence, a shadow cast by something no longer visible, stretching longer than the object that created it. In the town, there are people who swear the night still feels different when the air turns heavy, when humidity presses down, and the streetlights flicker with that same tired glow they had back then. They don't say why. They don't need to. The feeling has no language left, only recognition. A collective muscle memory, a sense that something unresolved is still passing through. Inside old houses, in drawers that haven't been opened in years, papers remain. A receipt, a note, a phone number scribbled and crossed out. Things that meant nothing until they meant everything, and then meant nothing again when time moved too far ahead. One woman finds a cassette tape while cleaning out her late father's garage. She doesn't know what's on it. She doesn't own anything that can play it. She throws it away, somewhere in a landfill. The tape waits, erased by weather, its contents lost without ever being known. The case doesn't react. It absorbs the loss like it always has. Former investigators dream about it. Not dramatically, not every night, just enough to remind them it's still there. In the dreams, they're always late, arriving after something crucial has already happened. A door already closed, a voice already gone. They wake with the same thought they had on the job. If only one thing had been noticed sooner. The confession, once explosive, now feels brittle. Younger people reading it online react differently. They don't feel shock. They feel suspicion, a modern instinct, trained by decades of wrongful convictions and overturned cases. They question motive. They question language. They ask why there was no follow-up, no corroboration, no physical anchor. The confession, stripped of its emotional power, becomes just another object under glass. examined, doubtful, incomplete. And yet, there's still those who cling to it, because a flawed answer can feel safer than no answer at all. The idea that the story ended, even badly, is comforting. It allows life to continue without constantly glancing over its shoulder. To challenge the confession is to reopen the wound, to admit that the truth might be darker, closer, more familiar than anyone wants to believe. The victim's name continues to circulate quietly, not loudly enough to trend, not urgently enough to demand action, but persistently. A scholarship fund, a memorial bench, a brief mention during a community meeting when someone talks about unsolved crimes. The name is spoken with care, as if it might fracture if handled roughly. The person is remembered more clearly than the crime now. That, at least, is something time couldn't take. In law enforcement circles, the case has achieved a strange status. Not infamous, not famous, educational. It is cited when discussing tunnel vision, the danger of dramatic breakthroughs, the seduction of endings. It teaches without solving. It warns without accusing. It leaves behind a discipline shaped by regret. Somewhere far from Florida, a man reads about the case late one night. He pauses longer than expected. He rereads a paragraph about the timeline, about the sound, about the gap that never closed. His reaction is invisible to everyone else. No call is made. No letter is written. He simply closes the browser. The story moves on without noticing him. If he knows something, the case gives no sign. It has learned not to hope. The years continue their work. The town grows. The roads are repaved again. New machinery hums where old machines once did. The sound changes, but the echo feels familiar. The case does not recognize progress. It recognizes patterns. In the end, this is what remains. Not an answer, not a villain unmasked, but a lesson etched into time. That truth is not guaranteed by effort. That justice is not automatic. That some stories do not resolve because resolution was never preserved when it mattered most. The Florida 1992 cold case endures not because it demands attention, but because it resists erasure. It lives in the quiet after headlines fade, in the caution embedded in future investigations, in the understanding that every unsolved case is not just a failure of evidence, but a reminder of how easily certainty can slip away. And so the story continues without progressing, suspended in that uneasy space where memory replaces proof, where absence becomes its own kind of presence. No final revelation, no last-minute confession, just a long, unbroken line stretching from one night in 1992 into the present, carrying with it the weight of everything that was missed, everything that was assumed, and everything that will now remain permanently unanswered.